All right, we are there. I'm going to go ahead and declare the meeting officially open. So hello, everybody on Zoom and in the room. Thank you very much for coming out to this talk on sea level rise in Carpinteria. I have titled it The Map, the Curves, and the Timeline for reasons that will become apparent. I'm John Callender. I'm one of the co-founders of Carpinteria Birdwatchers, which is not necessarily relevant to sea level rise. But I was previously on the Carpinteria Planning Commission and part of the General Plan Update Advisory Committee, so have sat through many meetings and read many reports. And now that I'm no longer on those bodies, I guess I'm looking for an outlet to share my thoughts on the subject. So you're my victims in that endeavor. So apologies in advance. But I'll go ahead and get started. I need to share my screen. And for strange reasons I've never figured out, I must narrate everything I'm doing when I do this. Okay, so if that worked, you can see my screen. And we will go ahead and start the slideshow. Those of you on Zoom, we do have you kind of locked down, so you can't speak or show yourself. But you can or should be able to send messages via the chat. And Tom Beland, who is in the Zoom meeting and also in the room, is monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, I encourage you to ask questions, but do it via chat, and then Tom will relay it to the room if I don't notice it in Zoom. And for the people in the room, also, I encourage questions. So feel free to, interrupt at every opportunity. Okay, so we're going to get started. And the topic, as I already said, is the map, the curves, and the timeline, sea level rise in Carpinteria. And I started with this Albert Einstein quote because I thought it was appropriate. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. It is my personal view that the topic of sea level rise, while it can be complicated, is not overwhelmingly complicated. The basic facts are understandable by ordinary mortals, and it's in our interest in Carpinteria for reasons that become clear, that we pay attention to the issue and understand it and learn about it. But to do so kind of helps to try and simplify. So this is an effort for me to simplify that information and present it in an accessible way. So to the extent you get confused, it's my fault. It's my failure to reach my own goal I've set for myself. So definitely in that case, raise your hand or just speak up and say, I don't understand that part. Can you explain? A funny thing was, when I researched this, Albert Einstein didn't actually say that quote. What he said was this in a public lecture in 1933. So now that we have the internet, you can dive in and research these things, if you're obsessive that way, as I am. The supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience, which basically means the same thing. But this is how Einstein said it in 1933. And then 17 years later, a composer who was writing a review or an article that showed up in a magazine paraphrased it and said, oh, as Einstein said in this lecture, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. But didn't put quotes around it, just, was paraphrasing. But then another person, a poet, was writing another article in 1950, and they read the first article, and they went ahead and reported it, but they put quotes around it. They said, no, Einstein said it this way. And that's the version that caught fire and spread in the public mind, such that it's what we remember today. It's one of his most widely quoted statements, even though he didn't actually say it, which I think is ironic and kind of funny, but also instructive, and as I try and make this stuff accessible and understandable and mimetically contagious so that people will remember it, it's not enough to be really smart like Einstein. Not that I'm comparing myself to Einstein, but it's not enough to be really smart. You also have to, have that composer's sensibility to actually distill it down further, to actually apply Einstein's concept in a way that Einstein didn't do, to make the thing simpler even still, while still retaining its essential. Anyway, I'm going on. So for tonight, I'm trying to channel all three of them, right? Einstein and the composer and the poet, to present this information in a way that's interesting. Maybe I can hide the controls, which I think is not Tide flow meeting. There we go. That'll be better for us in the room. So I realized after putting this presentation together that I was just assuming that everyone knows what sea level rise is, and maybe they do. But then I thought, well, I should add that. So there's a little preamble here. This was the second preamble after Einstein. What is sea level rise? So we live in a beach community. We understand that if you talk about what is the level of the sea, right, what is the elevation of the ocean, well, it changes. And it changes on all these different time scales. So if you go down to the beach, there's waves and it goes up and down, some numbers of feet. If you're a surfer, there's like the big sets every few minutes. There's the outsider, so it goes even more, right? So it changes on those scales. And there's tides. So twice a day, the level of the sea goes up and comes down in response to the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. And twice a month, when they line up, we get spring tides. So you get even bigger ranges. So there's all these cycles that repeat. So the ocean's elevation is always changing. A couple times a year, when they line up just right, you get king tides, which are even a little bit bigger. And there's even some longer cycles, El Nino effects, and something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that I don't understand at all, except that I've seen the phrase mentioned in these talks. So the ocean is always going up and down. But conceptually, if you think about it, if you could just average all that out, all those sort of ongoing cyclical things, average them all out, there would be a level of the ocean. And then it turns out on longer time scales, centuries, millennia, millions of years, there's also change. The ocean goes up and down, primarily in response to climate changes. And as most people are aware at this point, humans are conducting a large-scale climate change experiment to see what happens when we change the greenhouse gas concentrations of the atmosphere and warm up the planet and warm up the oceans. And the scientists who study the history of these sorts of changes say, oh, we know what's going to happen. The ocean is going to rise. And that is sea level rise. So sorry, I have to send these controls away again. There we go. A long-term increase in average global sea level caused by the thermal expansion of warming ocean waters and melting of land-based ice, like glaciers and ice sheets. And you don't need to remember all that, so I probably shouldn't have put it in here. I'm violating Einstein's advice. But in general, that's what it is. It's this concept that, over normally very long time scales, but in the current circumstances, concerningly short time scales, we are raising that average level of the ocean. So all those other fluctuations, those waves and those tides and all that stuff, is all being shifted upward. So the upper end of it, which is what we're concerned about for flood safety for coastal communities, that shifts up too, and that creates a problem. So that's what we're talking about. So as I say, 3 key things. There are 3 slides in this presentation that if you understand them and remember them, you will be well equipped to understand this issue in a way that I think a lot of people in Carpinteria would benefit from if more people had that understanding. So that's my goal here, is to talk about it. And the first of those 3 slides is the map. So to get to that, I want to talk about this. This is a report that Carpinteria put together with funding from the California Coastal Commission. It was published in 2019. It is the Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Project. And I was very excited that this was happening at the time because I was concerned about this issue, and I was happy to see that the city was going to address it and that we were going to make progress. So we did. This is a map. This is not the map, but do any of you recognize what this is a map of? Yes, this is a map of Carpinteria, and there's the reef off Sand Point.
The Thomas Fire.
So this would be probably pre-Thomas Fire. I think that's just ag land, and then we get into Chaparral. But you've got the 101 freeway here. You've got Carpinteria Creek coming down here. You've got the Carpinteria Salt Marsh over here. So that's where we live. We are right about, I think we're right here. Yeah, so hello. Here is a zoomed in portion of that map. And this shows a really key location in Carpinteria for the current discussion. This is the beach neighborhood over here on the right. Here's Linden Avenue. Here's Ash Avenue. Sandyland Road is the road closest to the beach. Here's Elm and Holly and Ash. And if you go to the beach, Carpinteria, it's like, where are you going? I'm going to Second Beach or whatever, Third Street or whatever. Or you just say, no, I'm going to Holly, so they know what you're talking about. But that's where our city beach is. The state beach is off camera over here on the right. Here again is the salt marsh. These buildings over here to the west of Ash Avenue are outside the city limits of Carpinteria. Those are county land. And although those buildings are going to be very much on the front lines of dealing with sea level rise, they weren't covered in the city's vulnerability assessment. So they're not going to be featured on this map we're going to look at in a second. Okay, enough build up. Here is the map. So the map, the curves, the timelines, this is the map. And this is figure 1 from the city's vulnerability assessment. And what it shows is that same area we were just looking at, right? Except now they have color-coded the buildings. And they've color-coded them, actually, this is the map where we have the legend. You can see what it's talking about. They've color-coded them according to whether those buildings are subject to flood hazards at different amounts of sea level rise. So setting aside the sort of sometimes controversial question of whether sea level rise is happening or how soon is it happening, we'll get to that later. This just says, if it happens and it happens by this amount, these are the buildings that would be affected. So you can see there's a row of purple buildings right along the beach, and those, it says, are vulnerable at 0 feet of sea level rise. So basically they're vulnerable today. And one of the key things about this map that isn't shown here, but is mentioned in the discussion in the city's document, is that these are assessments of vulnerability without taking defensive measures. So if you don't try to stop the ocean from coming, if you don't try and put up a berm or a seawall or things like that, these are the structures that are going to get flooded at different amounts. So these beachfront homes and apartments and condos are vulnerable today. Then if you get 1 foot of sea level rise, they're still vulnerable. Every category gets hurt worse at the next category up. But also now we add all these buildings in red. So a lot of Silver Sands Mobile Home Park, which is over here, a lot of these homes in this part of the beach neighborhood. And then at 2 feet, all of them are still getting hammered, and now we're getting the orange structures as well. So at 2 feet of sea level rise, most of this neighborhood is being impacted by flood safety hazards, by flood hazards. So this is like, storm waves, high tide events, things like that. They have the potential to cause flooding. And as sort of an interesting check on how accurate that assessment is, the city puts up this berm in the winter months every year. It's what the bulldozers are doing in this photo. They finished pushing up this berm. This is the winter beach berm. And basically what the city of Carpinteria does is, partly with city funds, partly with funds from the homeowners along that south side of Sandyland Road, they put up this berm every winter. And it's to protect those structures from storm waves, from being inundated and messed up by flooding. And in some years when they have not done that, they have in fact had storm damage, flood damage to those structures. So it kind of reinforces that, yes, the people who made the map knew what they were talking about. Those structures are vulnerable even today.
Does that berm
Yeah.
include the homes along Sandyland
Uh,
that are in county property?
no, it does not. What they have is a riprap seawall, like a rocky seawall that they built like at the very end of the period of time in California when you could do that without getting in trouble with the California Coastal Act. So yeah, they have a harder armor than what we have, and they have it all the time. We just have this in the winter months. Something else, going back and looking at the map for a second, is that, especially if, I'm very zoomed in here to show you just this portion of the map, but especially if you zoom out and look at the rest of Carpinteria, most of which is fine in terms of sea level rise risks. the beach neighborhood is really like, sea level rise really has it in for the beach neighborhood. It's like that neighborhood is really suffering from sea level rise in a way that the rest of Carpinteria really isn't. Like you see these other areas in yellow, if you get up to 5 feet, they start to be affected north of the railroad tracks here. But below 5 feet, it's really just this neighborhood for the most part that's getting it. And that's sort of interesting. Like, why would that be? And the answer is visible in this aerial view. So this is, again, a Google Maps view kind of looking down at Carpinteria. You can see the beach neighborhood here, and you see the railroad tracks. And it's interesting that as the railroad tracks come past Concha Loma here, and then past Carpinteria Creek, they start heading inland. So that's why that whole State Beach area is south of the railroad tracks, right? And it continues on the north side of the beach neighborhood, and then continues on the north side of the salt marsh. Well, the reason why it does that is that in 1900-ish, when the railroad line was put in, this was all salt marsh. The beach neighborhood and the State Beach is built on what was, until around 1900, just an extension of the Carpinteria salt marsh. So it was a coastal estuary that flooded every high tide. It was flat, it was low. And when they went to develop the beach neighborhood, they did it by putting in some canals to drain the water, bringing in some fill dirt to build the community up above the high tide line. And when they built it up above the high tide line, they didn't go any further than they absolutely had to, because fill dirt cost money and they wanted to make money. That was why they were doing this. So what we did, in effect, is we engineered a 47-acre neighborhood specifically designed to be vulnerable to small amounts of sea level rise. So you got this whole neighborhood, it's very flat, and it's like a foot above the high tide line. So that's why it's so vulnerable. That's why it gets hammered so hard. One more thing I will mention that's in the city's report that isn't visible on this map is that they identified that 2-foot level of sea level rise as a key tipping point. And what they describe is that when you get to 2 feet, not only is most of that neighborhood now subject to flood damage, but defensive measures like the winter beach berm, or even like more permanent versions of that the city might build, largely become ineffective. So at 2 feet, even if you're putting up a berm or a dike or something to try and defend that neighborhood, at 2 feet, it's not really going to work anymore. The storm waves are going to tend to overtop it and erode it away, and you'll get flooding. So you're all solid on the map? All right, so 1 slide of 3 under your belts. Before I go on to the curves, I did want to mention just one more thing, which is that this is kind of abstract. It's a map with little colors and stuff. But really what we're talking about is a residential neighborhood being flooded. And it looks like this. We should keep that in mind, I think, when we're looking at that map. This is what we're talking about, at 2 feet of sea level rise. This is Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Hurricane Sandy in 2012. So, picture that beach neighborhood like this. That's what we're talking about if we're talking about 2 feet of sea level rise in our residential neighborhood. Okay, so any questions about any of that stuff? Any feedback from, yeah?
The sea level rise at the 2 feet, would that be just a storm thing, or would that just be all the time?
What it would be is we'd be talking about all those fluctuations, those tide-based fluctuations, and storms cause their own, like, storm surge. You'd be looking at, the worst case scenarios, like would be a spring tide or even a king tide at the same time as a storm. And suddenly you add all those things together and we're over the top of the berm, we're flooding the neighborhood. And, the higher it goes, it starts happening more frequently. And, a flood every century or so, it's not good, but you can kind of work around it and deal with it. A flood every year is a different story. And a flood every month is like, we got to do something about this flood, Anything else?
What I found one of the most difficult, actually impossible things to find is to put a timetable on it.
Yeah. You've anticipated part 2, the curves.
And I say that I wrote something about this a long time ago. I'm trying to remember what it was, but there's a town very similar to Carpinteria in Scotland or Ireland, I believe, on the coast, the coastal has railroad tracks and all that. And several years ago, they were already starting to manage retreat.
Yeah, and this is not a situation unique to Carpinteria. You know, I'm very focused on Carpinteria here, but this is playing out all over the world because sea level rise is all over the world, and people like to build next to the ocean. You know, it's a cool place to have your community. So there's a lot of places dealing with this same problem. So let's talk about the curves. And what this gets at, you know, again, part one was all about forget about how likely it is to happen or how soon it will happen. This is what it will look like when it happens. You know, we can just use physics and say, this is where the water goes if it goes up this much. Now I'm looking at how soon will it happen? And that's obviously very important to assessing the risk. And I start with this slide. I don't want you to have to understand this slide. I've spent so much time trying to understand this slide. This is from a 2018 report that the Coastal Commission encourages coastal communities in California to use as their source of guidance on the probabilities of future amounts of sea level rise. And, you know, the numbers are useful, but I think they fail the Einstein test. You know, they're not as simple as possible. I find this very complicated to try and understand. So I'm just going to move on. So in the city's vulnerability assessment, they took that same report, those exact same numbers, and they presented it to the city's decision makers like this. And I would argue they've also failed the Einstein test, but by going the other way. They've solved the problem that it has too many numbers, right? Now it has a manageable number of numbers, but it's too simple, right? Make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. I think they made it too simple. And I want to keep going, and we could talk about why I think it's too simple. Yeah, it's, you know, it's throwing away a lot of that information that was in the complicated version of the chart. And what it does is, I suspect, and this is just me suspecting, but having sat through meetings with other planning commissioners and city council members and kind of tried to call people's attention to aspects of these numbers that I find concerning that they seem not very concerned by. I think they're focusing on these low probabilities of occurring, right? Because you look at this and you say, oh, sea level rise of 2 feet, which again is that tipping point when the beach neighborhood looks like the aftermath of Katrina. By 2060, it's only like 40 years away. That's, you know, not a long time. Shouldn't we be concerned in our, you know, planning decision and building decisions about a risk like that? But then they look over here and it's like, well, there's a 1% risk of that happening, which is true. I mean, that's what those numbers say. So 99% chance we don't get there that quickly. 1% chance we do get there that quickly. And I think that lulls the decision makers into a false sense of security, because dealing with this issue here and now is hard. It's expensive, it's contentious, there's a lot of, it's just not fun. And they have a lot of other things to do, you know, and this is kind of a long-term issue. Yeah.
Is the probability there based on, what should I say, science of physics or history or something in between?
So I can give an answer, and we'll get to that on the next slide. So good question. The question is, what are these probabilities based on, and where do they come from? But just to finish up the thought I was expressing there is that I think the decision makers get lulled into a false sense of security by those low probability, 1% or less than 0.5%. So a 1 in 200 chance that we'll get a foot of sea level rise by 2030. Well, a 1 in 200 chance, we'll roll those dice, right, as a city. It would be bad if it happens, but it's probably not going to happen. The same with a 1% chance or a 2% chance, right? But what this version of the data omits is that there are scary things that happen at higher probabilities too. This chart just doesn't show them. So that brings me to the curves. And this is the curves. This is the same exact data from the same exact source, but I've displayed it as a graph where you can actually see the different probability curves. So each of these colored lines is a different probability. So there is a 5 out of 6 chance, an 83% probability that we will finish up at or above this line, right? Like we'd have to, if you think about it as rolling a die, like a 6-sided die, If you roll a 1 on the die, let's say low numbers are good, like the sea level rise comes later, high numbers are bad, it comes earlier. If you roll a 1 on the die for our possible future, we come in at or below this line, which is great. But if you roll a 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, we're at or above this line, which is not great. The orange line is the 50% probability. So right down the middle of what they think is likely is this line here. And you'll notice on this likely line, we get to 2 feet of sea level rise, which is what this dashed line is for. We get to 2 feet of sea level rise before 2100. So, that to me is a crucial piece of information in the data that we lose in the smaller version of the chart that omits a lot of those numbers. Because to me, a 50% chance is something we need to be planning for, right? We don't want to just hope that we're lucky. And so on, as you go up higher, yeah, the odds are less, like a 1 out of 6 chance. Let's say you roll a 6 on the die, we're on this curve. But that means we're getting to 2 feet of sea level rise before 2080. And 1 out of 6 is not a very high probability, but it can happen. And I think people have a pretty good sense of those kinds of probabilities if you play games where you roll dice or you play cards, play blackjack. You've got a 14. Do you hit or do you stand? Well, you have to make an assessment of the probabilities. So we're basically making an assessment of those probabilities when we're deciding whether or not we need to take this issue seriously in our planning decisions in Carpinteria. And I just think at least historically, I think we're making those decisions without really considering the full range of probabilities. So that's a lot of me just talking. I wanted to have an audience participation part. So I need a volunteer. I need someone who's willing to volunteer. And I'm going to ask Holden, who recognized this. Yeah, come on up here. So what I've got here is a 20-sided die that they use for D&D, right? And Holden looked when I was getting set up here and he said, oh, you got a 20-sided, you got a D20, you got a 20-sided die. What's that for? I said, well, funny you should ask. So Holden is our volunteer. Holden, why don't you scooch in so the people on Zoom can see Holden. Say, hello, Holden. Okay, so Holden is representing fate. Holden is going to control the future of Carpinteria. So which curve are we actually going to be on? He's going to roll this D20, this 20-sided die. And based on what he gets, we're going to see what curve actually describes Carpinteria's future. So cool. Go ahead and roll, please.
Everyone, don't think differently of me. Everybody. Right, 16.
Holden rolled a 16. Oh, that's not good.
What does that mean?
So we're just below this this green line. So we're probably getting to 2 feet of sea level rise in the early 2080s. Okay, so not good.
Sorry, guys.
Yes, that's okay. You know what? In this version of reality, we can try again. So roll again. Give us another shot. Maybe we'll get luckier.
Ooh, yeah, that's
Awesome. We're way down
better
here.
than better. Yeah.
We're down here in the white area underneath the colored part of the graph. So in this future, we don't get to 2 feet of sea level rise until after 2100. We'll be dead. Our children will be dead. I'm sorry, Holden, you'll be dead.
Okay.
Our grandchildren will probably be pushing, 80 or 90. So
They'll be above water. So.
it will be a different kind of problem, right? Okay, give us one more roll. We'll do a third one just to see. 5. So not too bad. We're down here. We're just above this sort of teal line. So we don't get to 2 feet by 2100 again. There's 1 foot of sea level rise. Those people in the oceanfront homes along the beach in Carpinteria are probably having problems by 2100, but maybe the rest of the neighborhood will be okay for a while. All right. Thank you, Holden.
Thank you.
Thank Holden, everyone. Okay. So that is basically the curves, right? So we're all done with the map and the curves. Yes. Oh, right. That was a question that was asked before, and I said it was going to be answered, and then I totally didn't answer it. Yeah, so what are the curves based on? So, and in fact, this data is out of date at this point, right? This is based on a 2018 study. And as I was prepping earlier today for this talk, these slides are slides I created a while ago, like years ago, a few years ago. I went to check that the links, which are on the last slide, still worked. And I went to the Coastal Commission's site where they have their sea level rise policy guidance. And they talked about the update to their data that came out in November of 2024. So there is new data. And I my heart sank because I'm giving the talk tonight. So I went and I skimmed it really fast. They do in fact use a graph that looks a lot like this graph. So I was very happy to see that they're actually showing curves to represent this data. And the numbers have not changed dramatically. Like the numbers still look pretty similar, at least in my hurried assessment. So if you're of a contrarian nature, or you just like seeing people, exposed as charlatans, go check out that report and then let me know that I was wrong, because that would make me so happy if I was wrong. But I think it still basically shows the same kind of stuff. Or at least it's close, but it's worth using the latest data. And then where this data comes from. So at least in terms of this version, and I suspect in the new version, they went through a process where a group called the Ocean Protection Council, which is a state body, part of state government, went and just assessed lots of different studies that had been done of predicted sea level rise, both globally and for California, because there are some regional differences based on land movement and things like that. And so they looked at, a dozen or more different studies, and they kind of threw them all into a blender and kind of assessed them all and came up with a consensus idea. The different studies do different kinds of things. A lot of them are based on like models where they say, okay, in the past, when we had this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we had this level of, oceans because we had this amount of land ice. I'm way beyond my area of personal expertise. I would encourage you to, dig into it if you're interested. But basically, it's a bunch of different studies, mostly by climatologists, by scientists who have spent their lives studying the climate. I always kind of expected, as I was talking about this issue and trying to raise awareness about it, I expected to get more pushback. I expected to have more people coming up to me and saying, well, climate change is a hoax. Don't you know that global warming isn't real? The scientists invented it because they wanted to, I don't know why, for some, lucky special reason that was invented right then. But I haven't really heard that, and I'm not saying that is not a view that some people have, but I think by and large, people are pretty good at taking advantage of expert knowledge. If I go to a doctor and they find something concerning, I listen to what the doctor says and I'm guided by it. If he says, oh, these are the odds of your life being this way or that way based on this thing, I don't really question the source of their expertise. I mean, maybe I go see another doctor. That's not bad, getting a second opinion. But I also am willing to take advantage of that expertise without having to verify, well, where did you go to college? And are you actually secretly a Marxist? And the kinds of things that get brought up with climate change denialism. So anyway, I'm both gratified and, I don't know, a little disappointed not to get more pushback on this question. But go read the report, read the latest report, find out if I'm wrong, let me know. But scientists basically is the answer. And I don't really know the details, but I kind of feel like we don't need to know all the details as long as we, are confident in how the process is being applied. Anyway, on we go. So part 3, we're almost there, the timeline. So all of this so far, we just to recap, we talked about what happens with 2 feet of sea level rise. What is the likelihood that it will happen as of different points of time in the future? And now I want to talk about what do we do about it? And here is where I feel like the city's vulnerability assessment and adaptation project kind of falls down a little bit. Like, I think the city's report did a really great job on the first part of the report, the vulnerability assessment, because I thought there was really good info in there and I thought it was really helpful. And then they get to the sort of the adaptation project, like, what do we do about it? And I felt like it got very vague all of a sudden. Like, it felt like it was written by different people, which I think probably was. So there's not a lot of specifics in the city's planning to date about how to deal with this issue. But we can talk about it still. So timeline. What do you do in response to sea level rise? I'm sorry for the people in the room. You're going to be kind of obscured. You won't be able to see everything. It's pretty close. What do you do about it? This is me kind of distilling a lot of stuff I've read just as an enthusiastic amateur. I'm not a scientist. I'm not, I was on the planning commission for a decade or more, but I wasn't, professionally trained as a planner. I was just a citizen on the planning commission. So there's a lot of information out there. What do you do about it? Sort of the first impulse is I would generally classify as protection. So the ocean is rising, it's going to flood our buildings. What do we do about it? We put up a seawall, or we put up the winter beach berm, sort of a softer version of a seawall that's only there during the winter. Or the city has proposed a more permanent version of that, where they actually build up a permanent dune in front of those buildings. So all that falls under the category of protection. You're just trying to create a barrier to prevent the ocean from getting in. The next level after that, different class of response, is accommodation. And here you're saying, okay, maybe our protection is not going to completely protect us from the ocean coming in, but we will modify the structures so they're more resilient, so they're better able to handle this. So you can basically do things like, say, you can only have garages on the first floor. All your living quarters need to be on the second floor. Or maybe just have pylons on the first floor. Some of those houses in, like in Malibu, those beach houses of the ocean is like come in and sort of undercut, and they're just on pylons now. That's accommodation. You're building in a way to try and avoid dealing with the worst effects of the problem. And then finally, retreat, which is kind of a loaded term, a dirty word in coastal planning circles in Southern California, because people don't like hearing about retreat. They think it sounds defeatist. It sounds like you're saying we have to move. No, we're not going to move. Well, yeah, you're going to move. It's a question of whether you're going to move before the enemy gets there, or you're going to wait until the enemy comes in and washes out your house, and then you're going to move. This notion of a managed retreat process, I think, is something that I've been, hoping that the city of Carpinteria would look at more carefully and more seriously for kind of a while now, and I don't feel like it's really happened yet, but hopefully it will at some point. I mean, at some point it will. I think the sooner it happens, the easier it is for us to apply it. Okay, but talking about this timeline, like what does a managed retreat process look like? And I'm focusing in on managed retreat because, again, at 2 feet of sea level rise, this 47-acre beach neighborhood is, underwater regularly. It's not good. It's looking like those Katrina photos. So we need some way of dealing with that. What are we going to do about it? And if the protection's not really going to work, and if the accommodation is kind of beyond our resources to like rebuild the whole neighborhood, well, if we're going to rebuild the whole neighborhood, let's just rebuild the whole neighborhood, not in the path of the flooding, right? Which is managed retreat. So there are some reasons why I think Carpinteria should try to be out front on this issue rather than lagging behind. So Carpinteria is a wonderful town. I mean, I think all of us here, hopefully most of us here, would agree this is a really great place to live. And one of the great things about it, at least from my perspective, is it is, should I use this word? It is conservative. And that has a lot of different meanings, and some of those meanings have acquired, kind of unfortunate side meanings. But I mean it in a good sense. There are good things about the past that are conserved, that are preserved in Carpinteria today. It is a small beach town in a time when most other small beach towns in Southern California have ceased to be small beach towns. They become something else, right? They become bigger beach towns. They become, much more developed beach towns. Carpinteria is kind of lagging in that sense, and I think that's a good thing. I appreciate that. But that can also mean that, it's a hard sell to say to the people of Carpinteria or the decision makers, city council or whoever, well, you should get out in front on this issue. Well, that's not really a Carpinteria approach to things. Carpinterians are more like laid back, right? I feel like I'm kind of walking through the 1950s sometimes when I'm cruising around Carpinteria. And again, I mean that in a positive sense. But there's a couple of reasons why I really think it's important for Carpinteria to be proactive and get out in front of the sea level rise issue. One is that we are highly vulnerable because of that 47-acre neighborhood being built like a foot above sea level on top of a former salt marsh. We're going to be hit very hard by even small amounts of sea level rise in a way that is not true everywhere along the coast. So we're highly vulnerable, but we also have high adaptive capacity, which is that there are things about Carpinteria, including that kind of conservative throwback to an earlier time character, that make us uniquely positioned to be effective in our response to sea level rise in a way that other coastal communities can't be. And if you look at the beach neighborhood here, so we're looking, what is this, west, right? We're hovering above Lindenfield and we're looking at the beach neighborhood. The part on the left, closer to the beach, has largely been, redeveloped, and there are larger structures there. There's apartment buildings, there's condo complexes, a lot of two-story buildings, which is the highest they're allowed to build under Carpinteria's planning laws. But over on the right side, the inland part of the beach neighborhood, there's still a lot of those sort of original beach bungalows that were built in the first half of the 20th century. Some of those buildings are kind of nearing the end of their useful life. Which is kind of a good thing if you're trying to figure out how to convert this neighborhood back to a salt marsh, which is what managed retreat basically amounts to. It's a lot easier / less expensive to turn, 60-year-old beach bungalow that's falling down into a salt marsh than it is to do that when that beach bungalow has been replaced by a, lot filling, envelope maxing mini mansion of the type that a lot of other Southern California coastal communities have turned into if you go in their beach neighborhoods. Anyway, so to me, the fact that we have that high adaptive capacity due to the history of development or non-development in our beach neighborhood makes it really important for us to try to deal with this issue sooner rather than later. Because if we wait and we continue to redevelop the beach neighborhood and turn it into something more like Laguna Beach or Newport Beach or these places that are all maxed out with much more intense development, then the retreat becomes a lot more expensive and a lot harder. And again, if you're building a structure that within the life of the structure is expected to be destroyed by flooding, it's not a really smart approach. It's not good planning. Even if it is in the short-term financial interests of the person who owns that property, if they're just thinking about the next 20, 30 years, so this is potentially a difficult thing to deal with, which is, I think, why the city planners and politicians have avoided dealing with it. Okay, so, and I lost my train of thought. You now can sympathize with all the people at the Planning Commission or whatever, where I was going on and on about this subject, because I would go on and on about it. Then I'd look up and realize oh, I've been talking for 20 minutes. And these people are done. They've got other stuff on the agenda they need to get to. All right, we'll move on. Anyway, on the timeline of my imagined version of how managed retreat happens, and this is just one way to do it, you could do it another way. I would love for there to be many voices coming up with better ways to do it, but so far I haven't heard them. But the first step would be a moratorium on beach neighborhood development. It would basically rezone it. And you would say, what, this area is no longer suitable for residential development. Now, that isn't to say they immediately have to tear down their houses. The houses will still be there, but it would mean they couldn't rebuild a bigger house, a newer house. And so at that point, attrition is kind of working on your side in terms of trying to empty out that neighborhood and convert it to something that's more resilient to sea level rise. So the first step would be a moratorium. And it's relatively easy, right? It's like you update a law and you just change the language of the law. I mean, that's not to say it's trivial. There's a lot of people who have to do a lot of work to make that happen. But it's doable. It's it's well within our means as a community to do that step. Second step, I think, could be restoring the coastal dune. So here we are above the state beach looking west again. And in the foreground, this is a dune system. This is the state beach's quote unquote living shoreline restoration project. They basically said, you know what, historically there was a dune here and it had dune vegetation, which is very rare in Southern California at this point. There's endangered organisms that eat it. And it serves a useful purpose. It protects the area inland from storm waves. That's what a coastal dune basically is, right? A coastal dune is what's left behind from the last really big winter storm that piled up a lot of sediment, a lot of sand and debris and stuff, and it creates this coastal dune. And it's helpful. It kind of protects the area behind it from the effects of sea level rise and flooding. Now, the city has talked about restoring a coastal dune in the city portion up here. But in the city's plan, they want to build it out here. We want to bring in a lot of sand to extend the beach and then build up this artificial dune with like cobble and stuff with rocks mixed in to make it more resilient and plant native vegetation on it, which is an interesting plan. But to my way of thinking, it's cost inefficient. It's taking all our resources that we need to fix this neighborhood before it gets to 2 feet of sea level rise and using it in a short-term effort to preserve the property values of these homes. And, you know, those homes are built on what historically was a coastal dune. The history of the beach neighborhoods development is the very first thing that happened is they built beach cottages on the dune because there was a salt marsh here at the time, right? You weren't going to build in the salt marsh. So they built on the dune. And then later, they drained and filled and built this neighborhood behind it. And then also, beachfront real estate value being as high as it is, they rebuilt those cottages on the dune. So now we have apartments and condos and bigger houses. But they're occupying, they're slightly raised, right? They're on the slightly, because that's what the dune was. You know, so if you want to recreate a coastal dune, which I think is a really smart thing to do for phase 2 of our managed retreat process, because it'll defend the neighborhood behind from, say, 1 foot of sea level rise, I think it should go right here. We should basically restore the historical dune. But, you know, if I owned a home along the south side of Sandyland Road or an apartment building or whatever, I would probably have a different perspective on that. But I think we need to have those conversations. And it's disappointing to me that those conversations haven't started happening yet. Yeah.
The dune area adjacent to the state park,
Yes.
do you know if that is representative of what was originally there, or did the state have to come in and sort of shore it up? Has the state maintained it, done all those things to protect that state campground at state expense?
The honest answer is I don't know the answer to the question. So the question is, you know, was state money spent, or what was the process whereby we got this dune that's there now in front of the state beach that protects the state park? I don't really know the history, so I don't want to, you know, give opinions that I don't actually know the answer to. Yeah.
To protect the state park area from that 2 foot sea level rise that we were talking about at the beginning.
So my opinion, which again, not an expert, I'm just someone who's read a lot of these reports and has gotten kind of obsessively into it because I've argued with people and I wanted to have, you know, a firm understanding when I'm arguing, is that it kind of helps you up to about 1 foot of sea level rise. And a lot of this is, you know, I'm making these pronouncements like, oh, at 2 feet, we look like Katrina, or at 1 foot, you know, we need a restored dune. The reality is a lot messier than that. You know, these high water events, these flooding events, they don't happen on a regular schedule. I mean, eventually when it gets bad enough, they will be like every high tide will have an issue. But, you know, before we get to that point, it's going to be like storms or when it happens. You know, there's like a storm surge or there's, you know, a really high tide with some big waves, and that's enough to overtop the protection. So it's hard to predict. Anyway, I want to keep going because we're getting there in terms of our time. Meeting controls keep revivifying, and they hide my titles. So, but this is the concept of the living shoreline, which you see talked about a lot. And the city, again, has sort of branded their proposal as a living shoreline proposal. And it does have elements of the living shoreline concept. But the concept is that, you know, one of the most cost-effective ways to protect a low-lying coastal area from the effects of sea level rise is to let it be the way that low-lying coastal area was before we started trying to improve it with cottages and ice plant to stabilize the dune and all the other things that we've done to modify that environment. That if you restore the native environment as it existed before we started altering it for our purposes, it can actually be very effective. And there's a lot of things about a coastal salt marsh and a coastal dune that work really well. I mean, you don't need to necessarily build them and maintain them at the same level of resource expense because it's just sort of what it sort of naturally does if you leave it to its own devices. And, you know, there's a lot of conservation reasons why, you know, again, coastal dune habitat is very rare, and there's other legal frameworks that, you know, encourage us to do things to conserve that rare habitat and protect the species that need it. So there's, you know, other resources available to kind of work together and kind of sell this concept to other constituencies. Anyway, it's a cool concept, and I would like to see it pursued more. Okay, so, but to my mind, this is step 2 in our managed retreat timeline. Step 1 was stop building in the beach neighborhood. Step 2 is restore the Sandyland Road shorefront to a coastal dune. And I'm not saying that's easy. I'm not saying I know how that could even happen. I've got some other ideas about it. I've got some other videos I've done about sea level rise and Carpinteria that I link to at the end. And if you have not had enough of me talking about this topic, you can find out more there. But there are ways I think it might happen, but it would be difficult, and it would involve a lot of conversations with people who own property there and figuring out how to do something like this. But that would be step 2. And then step 3 is to make that beach neighborhood look more like this. So coastal salt marshes do great at being flooded. They get flooded every day. It's just what they do. And the organisms that live there, they're fine with it. You know, they do just fine. And it serves all these cool purposes. It filters runoff so that we don't have pesticides washing up on our beaches because they get filtered out by the salt marsh. Just a lot of really great things about the salt marsh. Along with being a bird watcher, I'm a docent at the Carpinteria Salt Marsh. So once a month you can come out and I can go on and on about the wonderful things about the salt marsh, all the benefits it provides to the community. I think we should regain those benefits from the beach neighborhood and avoid the costs of having that neighborhood destroyed by flooding. So that's step 3. So it's not quite a timeline yet, but if we go through all 3 of those steps, before we get to 2 feet of sea level rise, huzzah, you know, we don't have catastrophic flooding in our beach neighborhood. We have okay flooding in our beach neighborhood because it's not a beach neighborhood anymore, it's a salt marsh again. But it's not a timeline because it doesn't have any times. So what I've done here is I've taken that very crude plan for how we would do the managed retreat process in the beach neighborhood, and I've overlaid it with the curves from part 2 of the talk. And I'm looking at how much time do we have? And so how much time do we have for each of those steps? So if we assume we are right down the middle of the probability curve, right? Roll a 10 or an 11 on the D20, it's the most likely outcome, right, is that we're going to get to 2 feet of sea level rise right around 2100. Well, if we started this process in 2020, which is when I created this slide and I was optimistic, do the development moratorium then, get the coastal dune restored by 2060, and the estuary restored by 2100, we're good. It takes 40 years for each of these steps, 80 years for the whole process. Seems pretty manageable. But if we are not so lucky, let's say we're up here on the, you know, we roll, I think it was 17 on the D20 gets us up here, or a 5 or a 6 on the 6-sided die. Well, now we need to get there by 2080 because that's when we hit 2 feet of sea level rise. But still, that's, you know, 30 years to get the coastal dune restored and 30 years to get the beach neighborhood, the rest of the beach neighborhood restored. So 60 years, it's kind of doable. This is all very hypothetical. You know, at some point as I'm creating these timelines and these graphs, I start to think, hey, so I was born in 1962. Am I going to see any of this? And I don't think I'm going to see any of this. Like a comment I made in an earlier video was it would take a combination of really good luck for me and really bad luck for Carpinteria for me to live to see 2 feet of sea level rise. Like it could happen, but it probably won't. This is really, you know, that flooding is not something I'm at all likely to witness myself. There's some people in here who are a little younger. Your odds are better of seeing that. But still, I think it's more like our grandchildren are the ones who are really likely to be dealing with this. So, you know, I don't know. For some people, the thought about, you know, 2 generations down the road is like, we've got more important things to worry about than what happens, you know, 2 generations down the road. But then you become a grandparent and you start to think, ooh, I don't want my cool little grandson to, have worse choices just because I was kind of flaky. All right, anyway, on we go. Say we're really unlucky. We roll a 19 or a 20 on the 20-sided die. Now we get to 2 feet around 2070. That means we've got about 25 years for each of these steps. And to me, that starts to sound pretty challenging, like still doable. Like we're going to have to do it. If we don't, we're going to have a devastated neighborhood and we're going to do it that way, which is, not a win. So we'd have to do it, but it would be harder. It would be more expensive and more difficult. This all assumes we started in 2020. We didn't start in 2020. One of my major frustrations as a planning commissioner that was a factor in my deciding to go do other things was that in the general plan gets updated in Carpinteria about every 20 years. So there was a big cycle to update it for 2020. And I had high hopes that as part of that this issue would be dealt with. We had that study that was done in 2018, 2019. Rolling into that general plan update was a great opportunity. We could revise the planning laws, and we didn't. We did not revise the planning, really. There were some small changes. I don't want to say we didn't make changes. There were some changes made, but not, I think, of a scope that reflects the things that you now understand because you've looked at the map and the curves and the timeline. Anyway, so we defer 20 years. We just say, no, we're not going to start until 2040, the next time we have the general plan update. So then we'll do the development moratorium. And, again, if we're at the 50% probability curve, that gives us 60 years to do the whole process. We're getting there at 2080. That gives us 40 years to do the whole process. If we roll a 20 on the D20, we're getting there in 2070. It gives us 15 years for each of the halves, so 30 years to do the whole process. I don't know. Seems hard. But, we'll deal with it when we get there. And as it becomes more of a real issue to people, which I think it will over time, hopefully, I'm really impressed that all of you came out to listen to me go on about this for this long. Of course, you didn't know it was going to be like this when you sat down, but still, you're here, you're educating yourself about it. When these issues come up before the Planning Commission or the City Council, or you will be informed and you will be in a position to, assess what they're saying. And if it seems to reflect an understanding of these issues, great, support them, encourage them. There's been a lot of turnover in the city of Carpinteria. We have a new city manager. We have a new Parks and Rec director. We have a new director of planning. We have a brand new member of the Planning Commission. Just this week, it was in the Coastal View. So, there are new voices out there. There are people who are younger and maybe see this more as an issue worthy of their time. So hopefully that helps. Yeah, so that's it. That's the map, the curves, and the timeline. Yeah, Jim has a question.
Is there any gauge or any assessment of how people in that neighborhood are feeling, or how worried they are, or what they feel the city's responsibility is to the choices they need to build there? Like, for instance, the city gave building permits through the whole history of that area, like they have.
I think that so I personally have less visibility into this than I did when I used to go down and, sit in the Planning Commission meeting every month and listen to whoever wanted to come up and talk. I think it's hard to generalize. I think there are people in that neighborhood who, I think they span the full spectrum. I think you've got people who think this is a hoax and silly, and this is just a left-wing mafia trying to take away their property. And there are people who think, no, this is a real thing and we should figure this out. But how do I get my neighbor next door to take it seriously when he thinks it's a fantasy? So there's a lot of, I think it covers the whole range. And I think in general, though, that to the extent I have heard from people in the beach neighborhood talk about this, they have been respectful and interested as I've gone on at length in some of these meetings about what I think the issues are and what we need to do. I think they are motivated for the problem to be solved. I think nobody's really articulated a solution that appeals to them. And so in that setting, I think they're likely to just say, hey, well, just don't take my stuff and, we'll see what happens. But, at some point, hopefully we move forward and start to make some actual plans. Other questions? None from you?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised, I'm not surprised that a lot of people don't, tell you that global warming doesn't happen. Because you have surface deposits, I'm a geologist, you have surface deposits from Minnesota to Ohio, from continental glaciers, so that area looked like Greenland not that long ago.
Yeah.
So it's really not a question of that it's happening. It's what we can do about it and if we're affecting it, but it's.
Yeah.
But it's happening, and the probability in when.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, like, again, when I started paying more attention to this issue myself, a while ago, that was more of a top of mind concern for me, like, oh, I'm going to be dealing with climate change denialism. I'm going to have to try and make this case to people who are not accepting reality, and I've just got to show them the data. It's like, no, it's more complicated than that. People have their own cultural reasons why they choose to believe or not believe things, but the evidence is there. And if you can get a discussion happening where, well, let's listen to what the experts say. And if this expert thinks differently, why do they think differently? Or if this person is arguing that the experts are wrong, what are their grounds for saying that? Let's talk about it. In a more hopeful sense, I do believe that Carpinterians are going to get really good at this. Again, I'm not sure I will live to see it, but I think necessarily we will get to where it's like just understood that, oh, we've got a plan. And for the next 80 years, this is where the beachfront in Carpinteria is. And then for the 80 years after that, it's going to be over here, and we're just going to sort of plan around that eventuality because that's the reality. And we're not going to be arguing over what's the reality. We're just going to be trying to figure out how best to deal with it. Yeah. Question?
And the first map that had the little colored blocks.
Yeah.
um,
Whoops.
there
I'm going to go
was
back.
the Parking lot for the railroad, since it didn't have any buildings at the time. Would we think that would be?
You're talking about like this area over here?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Linden right here. Yeah, so this corner of the beach neighborhood, like the spot is right here, is a little bit higher. Just,
Just the little,
just in history of the sediment and where just as they measured the ground to create this vulnerability assessment, little higher over here, just like it's a little higher over here, because that's where the coastal dune was. Yeah, I mean, you could argue that, I don't know. A parking lot, to my mind, a parking lot is a relatively resilient structure. I'd rather have a parking lot than a condominium.
be a building. So it's one point.
No. The building's on the other side of the track, they're planning for.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion about the proposed hotel, the Surfliner Inn, which I know has been contentious for a lot of reasons. The topic of tonight is sea level rise. For myself personally, I think this is just me personally, so, I realize it's contentious. I think the Surfliner Inn is an okay idea. Like, yeah, it's going to become beachfront, eventually. But, probably the life of that structure, it's not going to be experiencing that kind of flooding, or hopefully it's not. So I don't know.
Well, it's good to know that area is just a little bit higher.
Yeah, it is a little bit. Again, if you go back to the curves, it does count and it'll make a big difference. Notice how the curves kind of tend to trend upwards. So sea level rise, even if we really get our act together in terms of limiting greenhouse gas emissions, like I didn't really emphasize it, but these curves are based on the business as usual projections, the RCP 8.5, which is it's jargony, but basically these are the curves they drew for if we don't make rapid global progress at limiting greenhouse gas emissions, but continue to do it kind of like we're doing, which, unfortunately in the 6 or 7 years since they put that out, I think is kind of what we're doing. But if you look at it, it continues to go up and accelerate, like the curves get steeper as you go out in time. And that's actually probably the case, even if we do get our act together about greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of inertia in this system when it comes to sea level rise in particular. So it is likely that sea level rise will continue and accelerate for a few centuries. So however quickly we have to deal with it now, our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to be dealing with it even, more rapidly. Like they're going to have, the issue is going to be worse for them in terms of how rapidly the ocean is rising. Yeah, Bob.
This is something that you wrote a while back. That the, can you go back to that map?
This map?
Yeah, right there.
Yeah.
That bigger area that's under, red, mostly red. Is the same acreage as
The Bluff Zero parcel. Yeah, so
you said that it.
so this is my attempt to live up to Einstein's advice and make this as simple as possible. Again, if you're, a glutton for punishment, there are other videos about sea level rise that I put on YouTube, and you can find, there's a link to them in the description of the YouTube video I'm archiving right now. But yeah, the 47.5 acres of the beach neighborhood that we have to figure out, how to retreat from, how to take that residential development and find another place for it. Well, the Bluffs Zero parcel, which is the Chevron property that's currently being remediated up near the Carpinteria Bluffs, is about 47.5 acres. It's the exact same size. So to me, in my naive way, especially a few years back when I was putting these together like Legos and thinking, oh, here's a great idea. We could say, well, we'll come up with a way of issuing coastal development credits to the beach owners. When they leave their property, they'll get coastal development credits that they can sell to a developer up in this Bluff Zero parcel. And I go into all this detail about it, but it fails the Einstein test because I'm already talking, in too much detail. But yeah, there are creative ways to kind of make this process work, I think, but we have to start the conversation in order to explore those ways.
I think that's. Probably won't have any choice when it's too late.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the choice is an interesting angle and an accurate way to kind of look at it. Like we have choices today that we won't have 20 years from now. We'll have other choices 20 years from now, and they won't be as good. So I think it's in our interest to examine our choices today when we still have better choices available.
Well, actually, I got two more things.
All right, but we're basically over my 1 hour time limit. So
The financial institutions that be sort of harbingers of what's gonna come to when they start calling in mortgages or don't do 30-year loans or insurances go up. Have you looked into that?
no, so the question is like, when financial institutions get involved, how will this affect the process? Like banks with loans, or I assume insurance companies with insurance policies. Yeah, I assume that that's where it's going to become more real, is when it has those direct financial impacts on people who want to build or want to sell. You would think, yeah, you would think that there are smart people assessing these risks at those financial institutions, and they would have an interest if they have, a mortgage on a property that's, well, is it really the full value that they, I mean, it's all very complicated.
One last question.
Yeah, last question.
How do you feel our new administration would be affected?
You have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to,
That's a loaded question.
that's a loaded question. That's a question for a whole different talk. Like it was already kind of a stretch for this talk to be on the natural history series at the library. And yeah, I'd be happy to chat with you about that over coffee someday, Bob, and we can solve all the problems of the world there. Yeah, another question?
I'd like to encourage you to write a book about it. It's accessible for everybody, including high school and primary school kids, who would be the ones who can help us actually push it forward.
Well, that's both very kind of you and also kind of mean. I wrote a book once, a long time ago, a software book, and the amount of effort in writing a book is way up there. But thank you very much for encouraging that. And yeah, certainly, I mean, I'm trying to get the word out in as effectively as I can.
No, if you write the book about it.
Okay. Yeah, there's so I guess I'm gonna go ahead and wrap things up. Again, thank you all very much for coming and for your interest, and see you out there. Thanks, Bob. Okay, yeah, let's do that. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the Zoom meeting. Thank you, everyone on Zoom. Oh, wait, there's chats.
Well, that said was.
Was-
We appreciate.
Okay.
We're on film.
Well, thank you, everyone in chat. Thank you for your participation as well, in Zoom rather. So long, everybody.